So I just want to start by saying I had a lot of experience, and I thought there was not one thing in this world that I could encounter 10 years ago that would knock me off my chair, or that I wouldn't at least have a frame of reference for. You know, I've in recovery from addiction myself, was drug and alcohol counselor, mental health counselor for, years. And I seen some things. And then I went to a training about human trafficking, and I'm not kidding you. It blew my mind. It was like the Matrix. I ate the blue pill. It sent me back into all these cases and all these people that I encountered that I didn't really get it. I got the trauma, I got the addiction, at least, to the point I was developed at that stage in my professional life, but I didn't see it. I didn't see it. And it broke my heart. I lost sleep, realizing that there were people that I could have helped, or that if I had this training when I first entered in the field, I would have been able to intervene differently. And the fact that I've been able to engage differently since getting trained and getting retrained and getting more training, it's changed my life. And I really, it's a hard thing. I'm not going to lie to you. I think some of you guys might not sleep tonight, or might have times throughout the next week where this rents space in your head, because it's a horrible thing. But I guarantee you that it will change the way you see the world. If you're a working professional working with people, it'll change the way you see your client base. And the likelihood that you will end up encountering someone that you're able to move differently with, and to remove them from the system, or to help them heal from having been in the system, is huge. I'm going to start by saying that large portions of what I'm about to tell you have come through the Project Polaris and Shared Hope. Those are two resources I highly recommend you jot down, but just want to reference them as, the underpinnings for the material I'm about to tell you. The United States defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor services against his or her will. The one exception involves minors and commercial sex. Inducing a minor into a commercial sex act is considered human trafficking, regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion, because they're a child. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. It doesn't exist. There are children being abused, and that is the only definition that ever needs to be applied to a minor. So with that, I've asked Joy if she could please show us our first YouTube video.
Rich, I just made you the host, if you could make me the host.
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely.
Would you like the gems video?
Yes, please. So, there you go.
Yeah, and just for everybody, I'm very encouraged that you're here. And like Rich said, like some of you might have a hard time sleeping tonight. I wanted to give you a couple things that you can try throughout this presentation to keep yourself present. We're gonna all have stress responses to violent information. Putting your hand on your heart is a way to soothe your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system, whatever's being triggered. Also, like if you have jewelry, if you have a drink that has a lot of scent or flavor, like that's something that I would suggest keeping nearby, because as you take sips of that, your body and your brain kind of return to the present. And it's a good way to counter those stress responses so that you can retain the information that you receive. So with that, I will share my screen. And cool. And
I'm not getting any video over here, Joy. Any audio, rather.
What's that? You're not getting any audio?
Right.
Oh, okay. Here, I'll start it over. I'm sorry. I think I muted myself so I wouldn't talk. That does make sense. Okay, we'll start over. Sorry.
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that. I was just a child, so that's how I was supposed to live, like a child, like an adult. So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are and you know how pretty your hair looks. And it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at. And he says that he can be a daddy to you. The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was dependent on for support. And so that night, he takes you to a club, and he puts you up on the stage, and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you. And it's scary, but all the time, you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead. You're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night, he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do. And he takes you into a room, and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do. And yet, there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. Until you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 cents, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy. The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was dependent on for support. And you feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get. And everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it'll be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself, along the way, and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac, and you eating McDonald's, you're listening to 50, and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
So that is a powerful, powerful video. And there are a few things that I just want to pull out from it. The first is when you see the one caption that says 12 years old is the average age. That's the average age that someone is groomed and brought into the sex trade, that someone is turned out. The highest demographic is 9 years old to 17. That doesn't mean it's limited to those ages, but that's the most prevalent. And one of the things that I want to talk about, every child, every young adult, and many adults are all at risk for being brought into a trafficking situation. But there are a few categories that are more susceptible, that pimps or traffickers look at people and they look for what they consider low-hanging fruit. It really is a business model. It's what is my softest targets. And the things that they tend to look for are people in addicted families, are people that have already been in some kind of abuse situation and that show physical characteristics, their demeanor, the way they make or avoid eye contact. They look for people that already look like they have a hard life, that are mocked in school, that are overweight, individuals with mental health issues or intellectual disabilities, people in impoverished neighborhoods, kids that look like they don't have new clothes, LGBTQ children or teens, because of the likelihood that they're already feeling ostracized at school, or that they're potentially being rejected by parents, that they're closeted, they have a secret. These are all things that are viewed as ways to manipulate, areas where they can get a hook in and then can leverage it against them later. Immigrant families, especially undocumented. Who are you going to call? Who are you going to call? Who's going to come help you? Your family? They'll send your family back if your family makes it back. There are kids that come from wonderful families that have everything that you think would protect them from this, that still end up brought into this world. But these are populations that are at greater risk. And anybody that's in the mental health, addiction field, anybody who works with LGBTQ or immigrant populations, this is everyone you see every day. These are the targets. There are people looking at them as the way to make a dollar, that are actively looking for how to create inroads with these people so that they can get them under control, get them brainwashed, and start making profit off them. Perpetrators of human trafficking span all races, ethnicities, gender demographics, and are as diverse as the survivors. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about tonight is, if anybody remembers Stranger Danger, it was this thing that would come into high schools that would talk about how if you avoid strangers, that's the evil. That's the thing we need to be looking out for, these horrible strangers. Well, then our kids will be safe. So if you see a stranger, run, tell somebody you know. And the problem with this is most kids that are abused by somebody familiar to them. A family member, a neighbor, mom's boyfriend. The same thing goes with the traffickers. I really wanted dispel the myth. A lot of what I see people talking about on social media is that traffickers are only Latino and are here undocumented. I've seen posts about this, and there were recently in Malvern 5 men of Latino descent, some of which were documented, some which weren't, that were arrested for human trafficking. So are there people of Central and South American descent trafficking people? Yes. Are there women that were born here that are Caucasian? Absolutely. You know, the Epstein case. But closer to home, anyone from Delaware County, Pennsylvania, in Collingdale, there was a man that they called Satan who had women implanted into daycares that were providing him children. They don't look like a stranger. They don't look like someone that as long as you can identify, this look or that look, this descent or that descent, then we can be safe. Absolutely not. It is every race, color, creed you can imagine. It is actively a part of this international business that makes billions. So there is no safe way to just eye a person up and say, okay, well, thank God, they're Canadian, we're all right. It spans every definition. One person in Delaware County recently, a CYS worker, was arrested because she was viewing her job as an opportunity. She's allegedly was using her job as an opportunity to get an entrance into a vulnerable population and then to put them into the sex trade so that she could profiteer off of their misery. In Texas, a psychiatrist who worked at Longview Hospital was using his position as a psychiatrist to do the exact same thing with mentally ill people, with drug addicted people, with people that he knew that he could leverage. And he used his position and his education to do that. It's a Caucasian man with a doctorate. In Florida, I'll say this, and then I'll move on from trafficking demographics. In Florida, rehab owners were actually using their rehabs as a way to bring people into the commercial sex trade. This is pervasive in our culture. And it's entering into systems where people can be entering in because they really want to help, they really want to give back, or because they really want access to the vulnerable. And we need to have eyes for that too. When we get reports from our addicted family member or our client, and we start to hear things that just sound, do I trust this? This sounds beyond belief. Don't dismiss it that quickly. This is happening actively in the helping profession. My next topic is the control. Because if you've ever worked with anyone in an addiction, one thing that you'll hear people say often is, why do you go back? Why do you go back to the drug? And that infuriates anyone who's in recovery or that's in an active addiction, because there's an experiential understanding of why you go back. And the question itself is a bit offensive because it misses entirely the point. The same is true of why somebody returns to a trafficker, for very different reasons, but I want to explain some of those reasons. There are situations where physical abuse, emotional abuse, threats, isolation from family are all a part of getting a person to the place where the pimp or the trafficker is the only person that has any connection to the victim. And I don't use the word victim here loosely. This is a person that has been placed into a systemic breakdown of their life supports, of their self-esteem. They've been broken to fit into this model. And anything that comes in the way of that has been dismantled, has been destroyed. It's the opposite, if you're a social worker, any of you, it's the opposite of a strengths-based perspective. It's looking at strengths to destroy them so that this person becomes entirely dependent upon you. That is the pimp process. Imagine trying to leave that at that point when you've been broken down that way. There are other things that can be used. Videos. You know, your family's going to know what you do if you leave. What, you think they're going to want you back then? This is horrible, but these are stories that we've heard. Economic abuse. You know, getting a person to the place where they're entirely dependent, where they have no financial resource. You know, I have to leave a strange city with the clothes on my back and that's it. There have been situations where children have been used as leverage. You know, you can leave, but they can't. You know, or, you know, loyalty to the family of origin. I know where you live. I know what your family looks like. I know what your little brother looks like. These are real things that people have to contend with. And on the reverse spectrum of that, you heard it in the video, this idea that he really loves me. This sense that, they call it and we'll get into some of these terms and definitions later, some pimps, you know, if anybody ever saw the movie Taxi Driver, really try to establish themselves as, you know, you're my one, I'm your one. You know, how are you going to be disloyal to me after all I've done for you? And in the place of having no other resources, in the place of having endured that much pain and suffering, that feels real. It feels like you're the only shot I have. You're the only one who cares. And I'm wrong to question that, is some trafficking victims' experience. One second here. Some of the things that traffickers will use, and I have some pictures here that I'm happy to send to anyone that's interested. Some tactics that are used. Some traffickers use branding. And this is one thing that I encountered in my counseling career, but I didn't see. Pimps will tattoo, some pimps will tattoo with like their logo. So there was one pimp that was referring to himself as God. The girls had to refer to him as God. That was his name to them. And they would get God's princess, God's soldier tattooed on them. I remember meeting a girl I was working with. And I'm a pastor, if you remember what Kevin said earlier. And she had God's something tattooed on her. And I remember saying to her, like, oh, you know, what's that about? You know? And she looked at me with the most bizarre look. And if you know anyone who has tattoos, they love talking about them. You know, it's an easy way to get somebody to tell you about themselves. This girl looked at me like I asked her the codes to the nuclear bombs. She gave me nothing. And later on, after I'd been trained, and they showed some of the local PA pimps and their brandings, that came back to me like a flood. And I just thought, I asked her a question that in her mind, you know, you're asking me about my deepest secret that I can't tell you. You know, if I answer this wrong, I could get harmed. I would have seen that now, but I didn't see that then. And she walked out of my office without any benefit from having been there. Branding is as different as the pimp, so it changes region to region, pimp to pimp, but it's something to look for. Another control that pimps use, another thing that pimps use are rigid rules and social controls. Some pimps will make girls write whole notebooks full of rules that they have to follow. A few of them, I'm just going to go through a few terms. Automatic is a term that means this is what you automatically do whether I'm here or not. And the girl will know, or the boy will know, this is what I have to do. And if I get caught not doing it, there's a price. Bottom. A bottom is a person who's also been put into been put on the street or been put into the service, but they're kind of a junior pimp, so they're in charge, or they're, you know, the pipeline for the pimp to find out what's happening, or the trafficker to find out what's happening with the other people. And if somebody's not doing what's automatic, they're going to get told on, or they might be, you know, disciplined violently or however by the bottom. One second. Choosing up. The process by which a different pimp takes ownership of a victim. Victims are instructed to keep their eyes at the ground at all times. These are old pimp rules, and not all pimps, I don't believe, follow them. But according to the traditional pimp rules, if you just look around, you can be severely punished for that, because that's a way somebody could be trying to look at another pimp or look at somebody else to get away from the pimp who has ownership of them. Choosing up is literally you can be traded like cattle. You know, you're my possession, but I decided to sell you to somebody else as their possession. Because you belong to me, now you belong to them. Circuit is a series of cities among which people are prostituted and moved. And what I want to draw out by the last, by choosing up and by the circuit, imagine how dehumanizing it is to get traded, to be given to someone else you don't know, who now has full dominance and control over your life. The circuit, imagine being a 12-year-old kid who now is in Memphis, Tennessee, and who tomorrow is going to be in Kensington. How scary is that? You know, I remember being a kid that age and being out when the streetlights went off, and I got scared. This kid is being moved around and disoriented into areas they've never been to. What are they going to do? And one thing I want to touch on in that, the idea that everybody is kidnapped is not accurate. Some kids will be moved along the circuit or even brought into local prostituting situations while they're still at home. So, you know, you have situations where parents are doing this or where relatives are doing this. Joy's going to talk on some other situations. But if it is a pimp or a trafficker outside of the person's main support people, they can say to them, you're going to run away this weekend, you know, or you're going to come home late Friday, and we're going to take you to the Comic-Con, or we're going to take you to the Super Bowl, or we're going to take you to Penn State game, and you're going to work it. And then you're going to go home, and your parents are going to be mad at you, but that's whatever. And then, you know, be at such and such bus station at 4 o'clock. One of the things that I was first taught to look for was a series of runaways. If somebody's run away 4 times or had just this like spotty relationship with coming home, if that's a pervasive problem, 4 or more runaways is what they used to say, then assess for trafficking. That might be what's happening. Even though everybody's looking at it as this kid is just stubborn, obstinate, difficult to deal with, this kid might be doing that because they're afraid they're going to get killed, or they're afraid their parents are going to get retaliated against. if they don't show up on time and do whatever they are told to do. We need to learn to assess for that. Different kinds of pimps or traffickers. Finesse pimp, Romeo pimp. Again, if you ever saw Taxi Driver, that's a great example of that. Just the idea of, I'm in love with you, I'm the one that's going to make it all better, I'm your daddy. Another type or style, and not everyone falls into these categories, is a gorilla pimp, which is exclusively entirely through violence or force or threats. There's no loving relationship, it's just dominance. Quota. People have quota that they're expected to meet, and they have to meet a certain quota of people they exchange sex with, and money reclaimed from that. Seasoning is a combination of psychological manipulation, intimidation, rape, beatings, deprivation of food, sleep, isolation. So these are some of the things that go into the overall culture that makes it hard for these people to leave. One of the things that I've experienced prior to being trained and post being trained is the perception that people want to leave this, that they're running into the arms of the great, wonderful person who's going to save them, is a false image. That is not what this looks like. Often it looks like the person that is in your rehab or in your mental health program or in your counseling session that is the hardest person you have ever worked with in your life, and all you want to do is get your notes done and drink your coffee and stop being verbally abused. Because this person is in fight flight. This person is scared to death that they're going to do the wrong thing. And this person, now that they're sober or potentially getting sober, is feeling all the collective trauma that they've felt for however many years. I'm not saying this is stereotype. This is every client you'll ever encounter that's gone through human trafficking, but quite a few will just be very resistant and very hard to work with, but for every good reason. We would all be responding in ways that were frustrating, that were challenging. It's amazing if we're able to engage with somebody to get them to the point where their trauma arousal is going down, and to get to the point where they're questioning, when they're in contemplation. For those of you who know pre-contemplation, contemplation, or contemplating leaving, that's a miracle. That's an absolute miracle. So changing our view of how a person will respond when they're coming out of a trafficking situation is huge. I've been in plenty of situations where someone acts that way and automatically the facility or the counselors or whoever demonizes the client and says, well, they don't really want it. And that's an abdication of conscience. That's unethical. And with this particular population of people, it can't be our response. It can't. We have to, 12-step meetings used to say, we'll love you till you love yourself. We have to stand in the fury of their reactivity and use any professional training or means that we have to get them to a safe place. That's our job. And we can all learn new tools and new tricks for how to do that well. But we have to beat it out of ourselves and out of our programs, the idea that, well, that person doesn't want it, so, just let them go. I'll encourage them to go. I've seen that happen. A few myths. Joy, did you have something to say?
Yeah, just a housekeeping thing. Can you make me the host real quick? We had a couple people get kicked out.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Apologize for that. And I just admitted everyone, but I'm about to switch you back anyway, Joy. 1 second.
Thank you.
So next we're going to talk about some other myths related to trafficking. 1 second. Here we go. And Joy, you are the host again. One myth is that it always involves violence. Sometimes it involves violence. It always involves some threat of force at some point, or some tricking, or some defrauding or manipulating. But it doesn't necessarily mean the person's even been harmed physically through violence at all. And again, when we're talking about children, just the idea of displacing somebody. One person that I worked with was taken to New York. They were born and raised in Ridley, Pennsylvania. The idea of being let alone in Manhattan scared them to death. They were not physically beaten, but they were scared into prostituting because they were completely in their own minds at the disposal of this person. That was the only way they could get home. Second myth, human trafficking always involves sex. There is also labor trafficking, which isn't a focal point of this, but there was a story in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, where a 12-year-old girl was in a nail salon all day, every day. People walking by them all day, every day. And no one stopped to think, why is this 12-year-old Asian girl not in school? Those are some of the things that in doing trainings like this, look for that. Look for labor trafficking. Look at the places where you see children working or hanging out a lot. Oftentimes it is both labor trafficking and sexual trafficking. They work in the nail salon during the day, and then they work at the massage parlor at night. Another myth, traffickers always target people that they don't know. They can be romantic partners, it can be spouses, it can be family members. I have personally worked with people who I am honored to know, some of which are here, that have been trafficked by their families. And that began when they were 6, 7 years old. I have several friends that has been their experience. There is trafficking where people are cultivated off the street or off the internet by people that they don't know. But there's also people who are being trafficked who their trafficker is the most near and dear to them. Another myth, and this was a big one for me, when people talk to me about human trafficking, I assumed it was people from Asian countries or South American countries. And that is absolutely, horrifically not the case. Children born and raised in the US, as well as children that are documented and here legally, are trafficked in the US every day. And it's in our neighborhoods. This isn't, will this come to where I live? This is where you are. Another myth, only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. Men, as well as any member, LGBTQ as a group, are more at risk for this. They're targeted because of the fact that often they're experiencing some kind of conflict at home or at school, or isolation from supports. Or closeted, people that are engaging in closeted internet behavior are at greater likelihood for a trafficker to spot them because they know they can leverage that. They can leverage that shame. Myth: human trafficking only happens in illegal or underground industries. There are several. Charlie's Dreams, Delilah's Den. There are several gentlemen's clubs, strip clubs that I've worked with, girls that started working there when they were 14, 15 years old. And obviously not by their own volition. This is in professional places. This is advertised on websites or in even periodicals that look legitimate. We covered this myth already. Human trafficking involves moving, transporting, or traveling a person across state lines. Sometimes a person is kept in their own home. One thing I want to drive home: addiction or financial need on the part of the victim does not make them deserving, responsible, or culpable for their abuse. And I want to give two different examples of this. Obviously, at any point, a child is not responsible. It doesn't matter if they had a heroin addiction. They're a child. The stigma around addiction and the stigma around mental illness, and honestly, the stigma around poverty, makes us blame the victims here. I've seen that in our culture. Well, if they weren't doing what they were doing, they're a child. But adults, there's one woman I worked with who had been abused as a child, got into an addiction, and then as a 21-year-old started to pay for her addiction via sex. And at one day was told, now obviously this is already a victim. This is a traumatized person who is doing what they know how to survive. But at one point in her involvement in an escort service, was told, you no longer have a choice. You are property. You know, we can't blame victims here, and we need to remove the stigma and the shame from this and look at it as what it is. It's slavery.